Good afternoon, everybody. Today's video is going to be on virtual relationships in social media. A few new concepts, a few interesting concepts that we need to cover, but essentially there's 4 key points that you need to know. You need to know about self-disclosure in virtual relationships. So we've looked at self-disclosure already, but you need to know how it differs in virtual relationships. You need to know about the effects of the absence of gating. We'll cover that. And you need to know 2 theories, the reduced cubes theory and the hyperpersonal model theory as well. So this is what we're going to be covering today. Quite a few pieces of research in this, although none are named. So the first thing I would get you to think about in class is, can you name any of these 6? Now, most of you are not at a virtual relationships age, right? In the sense of most of your relationships are mostly physical. There may be someone in the class, I'm interested if you do exist, that has an entirely virtual relationship. I did have, in the year of filming, I did have a student who had a relationship with someone in Middlesbrough, and they would go and see each other physically every now and again, but they did live 300 miles away from each other. And so everything they did was generally done virtually. But the whole Tinder, Hinge, Bumble, dating app kind of thing, most students don't really do, though you will come to do it in time, I can assure you of that. So internet or virtual relationships are generally new. It's generally a new behavior, been going since about the 1980s in some form or another, or in its current form, like Tinder and dating apps, they've only been going since about 2012-ish. But it is a rapidly growing one. And I would comfortably say at least 90% of all single students will eventually go on to dating apps. There are many reasons for this, and there are a lot of students who are like, no, I'll never go on them. 90% of them are going to give in. I can guarantee you that 90% of them are going to go on dating apps at some point, because meeting people does become harder as you get older. And dating apps, whilst there are major flaws to them, there are some major benefits to them, mainly of accessibility. So they're used mainly among the young who've grown up with this social media technology, and it's expected to become not just a norm, but the norm in the future, essentially. So meeting people through the internet will be the norm in the future at some point. So as I've said, an obvious benefit to the internet dating or dating sites is one of accessibility. So, before dating apps, you would only meet people in your life. So in your sporting activities, where you work, where you live, for example. But with internet dating, that ability to meet people across the country is exponentially increased. So I've said, if I were single without internet dating, the only realistic place I could find love is at work, during my sporting activities, which is rare, on a night out with friends is probably the main thing, or through friends. Those really are the only 4 places in which I'm going to be able to actually choose some. And that's a very, very limited pool of dating. So a major benefit about virtual relationships is that it expands your pool of potential mates, like I say, exponentially, phenomenally. And this is a good clue. Now, I would argue that this is brilliant for evolutionary explanations of partner preferences. What we have here is basically male and female swiping right to say they like someone, or left to say they pass over them. And if you have a look, it's phenomenal in terms of the differences. So females will generally be on the app for longer. They will see more profiles. But if you have a look, 95% of this is heterosexual relationships. 95% of potential male partners, they will swipe left on to say no, thank you. Females are selective. They will only swipe right in 1 in 20 males. So males, you have to then go and compete with that. You have to be that one. You're competing against hundreds of people. You only have a 5% chance of being swiped right on. Whereas males, they will swipe right on over half of the people they come across. Males are not selective. They take a scattergun approach, and they'll swipe right on as many people as they can with the hope of just getting 2 people. And they are not selective at all. So whilst this is strictly speaking a virtual relationship, this is Bo in 2018 found that women are more choosy. You can also heavily link this piece of research and use it for evolutionary explanations. In fact, I would recommend taking this piece of research, which, by the way, is a very recent piece of research compared to, say, Milgram, Zimbardo, or Ash. These pieces of research we look at in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I would use this piece of research for evolutionary explanations. Now, I'm not going to go through the story of Psycho Sammy here. I will tell my students this in their class, but Psycho Sammy was essentially a girl that my best mate Gil met online. She lived in Germany. He lived in Southampton. He moved her in from Germany, having never met her. He's going to be so pissed off that I'm putting this in video form forever now, by the way. But he moved her in from Germany, having literally never met her, and moved her in with him, me, and his ex-girlfriend, who was still in love with him. And it basically turned out that she was a complete psychopath. Now, I will tell you this story properly in class, because she ended up doing quite a few genuinely psychotic things. But a big issue with that was that he couldn't ever see her. Oh, by the way, she lied about who she was. So when he met her at the airport, she waddled over to him and was not the picture that she had sent. Now, that doesn't happen nowadays because technology has largely improved. Couples can see to like FaceTime, for example. This is quite important. You're going to need to know this later on because this does actually impact the absence of gating. But technology has got to a point where it's becoming more like a real relationship, right? That's important to note. Now, there's a couple of things I don't really want to go through here because, again, feel free to look at the slides. They are useful, but you're not going to get a particular question on them. What I want to focus on more is I guess actually the benefits. This will be quite a useful thing to go through. Who might benefit from internet dating more? People that are, let's say, less socially skilled or suffer social disorders like agoraphobia, for example, or social phobia. They're going to be quite useful to these people. The drawbacks are obvious. People do misrepresent themselves either on purpose or not. They lie about their income. They lie about their job. They certainly lie about their photos in the sense of either they pull what's called a Psycho Sammy and put up a picture of someone else, or they put up their 6 best pictures. Now, no offense, but you look nothing like the photos you inevitably put on Instagram. Your life is nothing like Instagram. Your life is nothing like Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, all these dating apps. You look nothing like that. So you are misrepresenting yourself. But it's also quite an issue when it comes to anonymity as well. So just a couple of points there. You're probably not going to get many, if any, questions on that. What I do want to focus on, I'm not going to talk about this now because we are going to talk about this and have a proper debate about this in class. Our internet affairs, same as physical affairs. I love how rowdy it gets. But a couple of pieces of research, which, again, I don't really want to go into because I want to get to the first part of the actual spec. So everything we've looked at so far is useful, but you're probably not going to get a question on it. Self-disclosure in virtual relationships, you are likely going to get a question. Now, a recap. We have looked at self-disclosure in relationships already. Fine. Self-disclosure in relationships, as we have talked about, is when people will disclose personal information about themselves in order to elicit some sort of trust and respect and deep affection. Now, what you really have to know here is how self-disclosure is different in virtual relationships to face-to-face relationships. And the bottom line is generally self-disclosure is quicker, more intense, and leads to affection much quicker in virtual relationships. Now, you wouldn't think that is common sense, I would say, but let's have a look in more detail. So, a main fear with self-disclosures is that anything you say to your partner could end up going back to your friends if you were to break up with them. But what happens if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't know your social circle because they're online, for example? With virtual relationships, this fear of being exposed by ex-partners is much less likely going to happen. So you are more likely going to disclose information online because you're less likely going to suffer embarrassment. This is why males typically, although I would argue entirely, do the whole dick pic phenomena thing, right? This whole unsolicited dick pic, because they don't think it's going to come back to them. What I do love, by the way, is some females, typically females, have started fighting back against this and are now kind of sending messages back, like doing some investigative work and finding out their mum on Facebook, for example, and then sending a message to say, this is what your son is doing, which I love, by the way. I love that people are fighting back against this. But this is why the whole dick pic phenomena takes place. Individuals who are less socially skilled may be able to make disclosures here, whereas they're much less likely going to in physical relationships. Now, this is the beauty about virtual relationships. In a virtual relationship, if let's say your boyfriend messages you, there's not an expectation that you reply straight away. Maybe you're at college, maybe you're at work, maybe you're asleep. So you can go 4 hours before you respond. In that 4 hours, you can really think about your response. You can really mull it over, kind of, think about something that's really funny, for example. Whereas in face-to-face relationships, you can't do that. You can't be on a date with someone, sitting opposite them, and they say, so tell me, what do you do for work? And then you just sit there for 4 hours and don't say anything to them. That would look really weird, to be honest. And so face-to-face communication is really fast. It's rapid, in fact. You have to be really skilled in order to be able to keep talking on a 6-hour date, by the way. Dates can go on for 6 hours if you go from a bar to a pub, maybe, blah, blah, blah. But the point I'm trying to make here is that virtual relationships offer sanctity to those people who are less socially skilled because you can take your time in responding. And as a result, self-disclosure is thought to happen quicker in virtual relationships than physical relationships. This is also a little bit about anonymity here as well. And it's a bit tricky because it's a bit contradictory. Because people still keep an element of being anonymous, they are much more likely going to be truthful about themselves. Why would they lie? So if I were to say to you, it's a bit like counselling. It's a little bit like counselling. If you feel like the person does not know you and you're not going to be judged, or at least you're not going to see them judge you, you are much more likely going to tell them the truth. And this is the same for counselling as it is for virtual relationships. You're much more likely going to tell somebody the truth if you feel they're not going to judge you or you're not going to see them judge you, but also if they are anonymous as well. Sexting does come in here, but again, I don't really want to talk about that. A key problem, though, is de-individuation does happen. So I want you to link this to self-disclosure. Is the benefits of self-disclosure is that they happen quicker. Like I say, It helps the socially less skilled, maybe. But a problem of self-disclosure on virtual relationships is this issue of de-individuation, where you become anonymized, and so you are more likely going to act in a way that is not like yourself. So you do kind of have to know this concept of de-individuation. But in terms of research, Shelton et al., people high in social anxiety experience greater disclosure because of the benefits of virtual relationships. So it is helpful for people with self-disclosure. Yim and Hara found that cultural differences between American, Korean, and Japanese participants in how disclosure increased or decreased trust. Basically, in Asian culture, it's seen as a little bit weird which is understandable when I say it, it's a little bit weird if you tell someone something personal about yourself online. That's a little bit too weird for some Asian cultures, whereas in American cultures is a bit more normal. So what we have to say here is self-disclosure in virtual relationships is not a universal behavior. Is thought to be impacted by regional or cultural differences and influences, and therefore it's not kind of a behavior that all humans do. This is a cultural phenomena. So you need to know those two pieces of research. In terms of evaluations, I've not done model answers for this one just yet, but there are massive practical applications. If you have someone with, let's say, I don't know, some spectrum disorder such as autism, someone who maybe typically may struggle in the face-to-face, constantly rapid form of communication, if we can, get them to communicate through the internet or through dating sites, for example, they're going to thrive in those environments a lot more than face-to-face. So there's a lot of practical applications, especially if they're struggling to meet someone as well. Okay, so there is a question here for you. It is a 4-marker. It is a 4-marker AO2 question. And then you've got outline, evaluate, self-disclosure, and virtual relationships. So you need to know at least 4 things AO1-wise for self-disclosure there. But the next thing I want to talk about is effects of the absence of gating. Now, when I read this in 2015 or 2014, when the spec was coming out, I read this and I'm like, what the bloody hell does that mean? Here's what I want to ask you. And I'll ask you in class as well. If you go on a first date with someone face to face before you've even met them, so basically this is the first time you're meeting them on your first date, and you go out for dinner, I'd want you to think about, maybe pause the video and just think about what 5 things could they do that would make you think, ugh, no, there's not going to be a second date here. Whatever you write down, maybe worth pausing the video here, but whatever you write down is basically going to be what's called gating. So gating are things in a physical relationship that stop us or put us off continuing the relationship further. So things like, and I'm going to guess what some of the things you said was, eating with their mouth open, being rude to the waiter, chewing really loudly, if they don't offer to pay, that's a pretty big one. What else? If they steal some of your food, that person is my number one. You don't steal my food. You do not steal my food. Now, all of these things are physical things. The thing you really need to know here is online, you can hide a lot of the gates. So you can hide being rude, for example. You're not going to steal food over the internet because you can't do that. What else did I say? You're not going to be heard chewing with your mouth open. They're not going to hear you chewing loudly. So a lot of the things that put us off in physical relationships are not actually present online. And this is what it means, the absence of gating in virtual relationships. So these are some of the things that I have come up with of things that you can hide online. Stuttering, tics, they might interrupt you often, right? You can't interrupt somebody in an online relationship. If they're typing and you're typing at the same time, you're just having a conversation. Whereas if you're both just talking to each other, interrupting each other face to face, that's much more irritating. They might have a lower level of attractiveness. This may seem shallow or naive, but give it a few years. But I do remember going on a date once many years ago, and I knew within the first 5 seconds that actually she had picked six very like her six most attractive photos, but in real life she wasn't actually that attractive. Now that is virtual relationships, that does happen, but online you can make yourself more attractive than you actually are, and that's actually what a lot of you do already on your Instagram when you take 4,700 selfies to get 2 selfies. So this one just here, by the way, this one just here is a really interesting one. I will briefly tell you a incident from about 3 or 4 years ago where I was dating someone. It was virtual to begin with, and we got on really well. She was funny. We would have a good laugh, and we went on a first date, and it was one of the worst experiences of my entire life. We couldn't say anything, couldn't think of anything to say. There was absolutely no chemistry whatsoever. But again, that was hidden by the nature of online relationships. So that's essentially what gating is, right? They block off these deficiencies, but in face-to-face, gates block you off from progressing further with the date. But virtual relationships, these pretty much do not exist. You could counter that, I guess, by the way, and I'd say this is an advanced point. I'd say this is a really advanced point. So if you aim for an A star, you probably want to be paying attention now. One thing you could argue is because technology has gotten so good now, it's harder for people to hide their gates. FaceTime alone hides a lot of gates. If you're having a FaceTime with someone in a virtual relationship, they can interrupt you quite a lot. They can look a lot less attractive. I know if I FaceTime someone, I look like a human thumb with features. So your point could be that actually in virtual relationships, gating is starting to come in as technology develops a lot further. So that would be a really, really good point to be able to go for. What you could say here, and this is why the third point is so important. Say your first date is a phone call, your second date is a FaceTime, for example, and by the third date, you meet them, and all of a sudden they've got all of these gates. All of a sudden they're chewing their mouth open. All of a sudden they're a bit more unattractive than they thought. The theory goes that by a certain point, you have bonded with them enough that you will look past those gates. Gates are only good in the first one or two dates. Gates are only good for the first couple of dates. Beyond that, not so much. So Gil, if you remember my mate who brought Psycho Sammy over, Gil had been talking on the phone to Sammy every single day for about 3 months. And when she came over and he met her in Heathrow Airport and she was moving in with him and she wasn't who she said she was. She was nowhere near, this is my personal opinion, but also fact, she was nowhere near as attractive as she said she was. She turned out to be a complete psychopath. Gil was just looking past them the whole time because that's why virtual relationships are stronger, because you look past the initial warning signs because you've bonded with them already. And it's a really, really important point. Now, Barr et al. Found that intimacy develops quicker in virtual relationships because of a lack of gating features. It becomes sexual quicker in virtual relationships, and you think that doesn't make any sense. Yes, it does. Right? That's how strong virtual relationships are. And then McKenna found that the removal of these gating people did allow unattractive people to enter relationships. So again, good practical applications for those people who are a bit more socially or facially inept. Now, such as myself. couple of points there, I think. Maybe the first one to focus on is this one just here. There isn't much or I should say sex differences in research. Females probably do care about knowing what they're getting into. Do you know what I mean? Females, from a heterosexual point of view, females probably do care more about, like, well, I want to know that he's, a good person, for example. I want to know. Whereas males don't really care, to be honest. They don't really care. Just as long as someone's speaking to them and maybe willing to engage in some sort of sexual activity with them, I don't think they really care, to be honest. So, but no research has been done on this. So this is beta bias. A lot of this research is beta bias. The theory is minimizing the differences between the sexes by saying there's no differences between them, when in reality there probably actually is a difference. Now, the two theories, I'll keep this quite short. There's two theories, and they're, in my opinion, completely contradictory. So you've got the reduced cues theory. So obviously online, if you're talking to somebody on a face-to-face, for example, this is a tablet, by the way, not a book, you do get reduced cues. You can't see their face. You can't hear the intonations in their voice or the inflections in their voice, for example. So you've got less to read in terms of the non-verbal communication that you're getting. Now, the reduced cues theory is Sproul and Keisler in the mid-80s, and suggests that online relationships might be less open and honest than face-to-face because, as it says, in real relationships, we're relying on a lot of subtle cues, and these cues are not present in online relationships. So we have less to go off. We hold a little bit back because we've got less information to go on. So the reduction in communication cues leads to de-individuation because it diminishes people's feelings of individual identity. So the reduced cues theory is essentially saying that because you have less information to go on, less cues from your prospective partner, you basically hold back a little bit, right? You hold back, or you may become more aggressive through de-individuation. The flip side to this is the hyperpersonal model. Hyperpersonal. You are showing too much personality almost, right? Hyperpersonality is essentially what that means. So this is the opposite, where the reduced cues theory, I'll just go back here, the reduced cues theory says actually you're going to maybe hold back a little bit. Hyperpersonal model is you're going to be either hyper honest or hyper dishonest, but basically you're going to tell them a lot. You're not going to hold back in terms of the information. So Walther, 10 years after the reduced cues theory, proposed that self-disclosure in online relationships happens earlier, becomes more intense, more intimate, and more meaningful quicker, right? Quicker. And also suggested that virtual relationships may feel more intimate because it's easy to manipulate self-disclosure online than face-to-face. Essentially, this argues for the opposite of the reduced cues. Now, you probably do need to know a little bit more about reduced cues and hyperpersonal model. This is a basis for which you can go on. There's a little bit more information here that you probably want to pause, but essentially, the four things you do need to take away from this video are self-disclosure in virtual relationships, the effects of absence of gating online, reduced cues theory, and hyperpersonal model. If you get an AO1 asking you to describe and evaluate virtual relationships, you want to talk about all four of those, right? Remember, 8 separate things needed to be outlined for your AO1 for you to get 6 out of 6. Now, I've not gone through evaluations. I'm hoping you can, at this point, maybe evaluate yourself. You probably do want to look in the workbook. But as always, that's it. I've got a bit of a... there you go. So this one just here, discuss what psychological research told us about virtual relationships. For your AO1 equaling 6, I would want those 4 things and then 3 detailed, structured, and elaborated peels. Some of your other teachers may suggest you go for 4 or maybe even 5. But if you're my student, I'd want you to go for 3 more detailed peels where you're going to particularly elaborate in a lot of detail. Only got one more video to go through in terms of relationships after this, when we're going to be looking at parasocial relationships, and I may tell you about my stalkers, I may not, but I hope this is useful. Peace out.